Hi guys, Jonathan here once more. Now if you're thinking that you've seen this before, you sort of have, but not really. This is another in the, I think it's safe to say, ill-fated line of Sterling automatic rifles of the 1970s, heading into the 1980s as well. So a few episodes ago, I think some of you actually guessed that one correctly, we had the Sterling LAR, or Light Automatic Rifle. Now this was an early to mid-70s design from Frank Waters, who was Sterling Armaments chief designer. Do go back and watch that video on the LAR. Superficially, it was a bit of a big, clunky early attempt, and they were trying to, long story short, go back and watch the other video, replicate the design success, if not commercial success, of the AR18, the Armalite AR18, and ultimately their very early attempts from the early 70s of tubular section rifles really didn't work out. Then Frank Waters turns toward more sort of cheaply made, boxy section, short stroke gas piston powered rifles, now in 5.56mm. By this point, the M16 and the 5.56 cartridge had been thoroughly well established. Armalite had come out with the AR18 and the AR180, and that was seen to be a successful, or potentially successful design. It's certainly been very influential later on. The idea being that it was sheet metal, affordable polymers, production techniques that not first world countries could implement and make their own supply of infantry rifles. So I hesitate to say, like a dollar store M16. This is the next attempt from the LAR. So we've had our tubular section guns that look like Sterling submachine guns on steroids and weren't really going anywhere. We've had Frank Waters' first design with his own design of trigger mechanism, quite complicated. It's a bigger, bulkier, more awkward looking thing. This, the AR18, was a streamlined, much improved design, I think it's safe to say, and actually did go somewhere, which we'll explain in a moment. So let's take a look at this thing. It really is, more so even than the LAR, very reminiscent of that Armalite AR18. But assuming your lawyers have got their ducks in a row, you'd be able to, Sterling, manufacture this and license it directly, rather than having to try to sub-license on from Armalite, because the ultimate solution to the Sterling rifle problem, or the temporary solution at least, that they were trying to overcome, was to license the AR18, but there were limitations on that license. So to get around that, what you need is an indigenous Sterling automatic rifle, and that's what this is. SAR, standing for Sterling Assault Rifle. It's still quite big and boxy. Now at this point I should point out this is actually serial number 1. So we're very fortunate to have. You can see the markings there on the receivers. MFG Manufacturing, Sterling Armament Company, number 1. Very straightforward markings there. And that's really all we have on this, other than the selector markings of the standard ARS, automatic repetition and safe, on the selector here. And the selector is standard M16, AR18, depending on which version, style. The magazine is standard Colt pattern. The finish is this sort of black paint. I think it's probably the standard British Army Suncorite paint. It's probably phosphated underneath. Only reason I mention it is that the versions you'll encounter in photos or in the wild, as it were, won't have this finish. We'll have a look at a couple more examples of the variation within this type in a moment. So magazine catch on the left hand side. So, well, again, like the AR18, you have to operate it with your thumb, pull the magazine out. Two-part receiver, again, like the AR18. The sights are once again very inspired by that type as well. So as far as the obvious design changes go, we do have this much slimmer lower receiver. Simple square upper receiver. It's not so different from the LAR. The furniture is notably quite different, or at least the front handguard is. This is a proper commercially designed thing. High impact polymer, sheet steel heat shields in there. This looks so much more like a marketable firearm than the LAR, which makes sense. That was a prototype. This may be the first one ever made of the production type. This was a production rifle, so all of this makes sense. To really say much more, we have to take it apart. So we have to cock it. Well, we don't have to, but it's easier. Pop out the rear retaining pin, which you can lose, which is never a good idea. And then the rifle will break open. We're very used to this by now. I mean, the FAL was doing it in the 50s, so if you're not doing it by this point, you've probably got to have a good reason for that. And we've got the first major change. So if you go back to that LAR video, that trigger mechanism is big, bulky, complicated, and completely proprietary. The obvious thing to do was to put an AR18 trigger mechanism into the production descendant of that gun, and that's what they've done. So this is, and then they're making them. Sterling are making Armalite AR18s at this point, so it makes absolute sense to copy that design. There's nothing in patent law that would stop them doing that, so they did do it. So that's an important change. We can, of course, pop out the front pin as well. Well, I say of course, that's not always possible, but it is on this one. And then separate the two halves of the gun that way. Makes it a little bit easier to see inside, but no surprises for anyone that's ever seen an AR18 as opposed to 180, because this is, of course, a select fire assault rifle, as in the name, Sterling assault rifle. Which leaves us with the upper receiver, still looking very Armalite-y. A little bit awkward here is that we do need a tool of some sort, even if it's a round. This is an inert 303 round, funnily enough, so not related. And then we have to kind of finagle these catches so that first one is put out of position, and then the other, and we have to keep our finger on the spring guide backplate assembly, otherwise this whole thing goes launching out the back of the gun like a catapult, which I did do off camera. And you see there are just two plungers there that keep it in the back. I do think the Armalite solution to keeping this in place, and dare I say even the SA80 solution to that, where the retaining pin for the receiver does the job, is much better than this, because having to waggle around a tool to even get this out doesn't seem ideal. But this isn't a review. So, double guide rod and spring setup, AR18 all day long. And then now the bolt gets easily hung up without everything assembled together. It's extremely prone to hanging up inside the gun. So we get that so far back. You know the drill by now, guys. This is basically the same setup as the LAR, basically the same as the AR18, and therefore all of the derived rifles like SA80, FN Scar, that kind of thing. Right, we've skipped ahead because this takes apart just like any other AR18 style bolt carrier group. Does still have a couple of design quirks that tell it apart from an AR18, but the big deal here, and the only patent that applies, is embodied in this bolt, or bolt head if you want to call it that. So I've stopped at the point of, I've removed the cam pin. If we then start to remove the bolt, now I have to overcome a bit of resistance there, and out it pops. And if we can pick that up on camera, this is the bolt partly out, and as I remove it the rest of the way, I'll put my finger over the extractor. There we go. So that's completely normal. The bolt itself is completely normal, but Sterling's patent was for an extractor that's held in place by the bolt carrier. So you don't have a separate pin that you have to remove to take out the extractor. Literally, that extractor is held in place by, I suppose, the interference fit, really, of, well, no, it's not an interference fit, but by the bolt carrier. That's all that holds the extractor in, such that when you remove the bolt, the extractor would fly off if I didn't put my finger on it. So Sterling patented that minor technical detail, and that's all that really sets it apart, technically speaking, from an AR18. Is that a good idea? I'm no engineer or firearms designer, but I don't think so, because having to compress this extractor into place, you see there's a spring underneath it, having to keep that constantly under pressure greatly increases the friction of this bolt in the bolt carrier, which can't be a good thing. You pick up an AR18 or AR15 bolt carrier group, with a slight flick of the wrist, the bolt should move back and forth into its positions, because it has to rotate to lock. That's why this thing is moving back and forth. It's just going to be harder for it to move back and forth if it's under spring pressure the whole time. Seems a bit weird. Don't get me wrong, this whole thing is greatly simplified over the LAR. You know, the spring doesn't come off the firing pin without effort, so I'm not going to. So it's almost as simple as an AR18. In fact, it is, in terms of parts numbers and manufacturing. And that tiny little change, in theory, coupled with making the whole thing a lot simpler than the LAR, would be a tiny advantage. But not if it makes the gun stop working, which I have a feeling it certainly wouldn't help. So jury's a little bit out on that one. Bit of a technical dive, but that's the only way to differentiate this meaningfully from the AR18. We have got this chunky spring integral to the firing pin, which is another departure. Apart from that, all very familiar. And the final sort of technical bit is the handguard disassembly. Now, that's a little bit like an AR-15 in that you have to manually pull back and lever off the upper handguard. Whereas on the Armalite, as soon as you break the gun open, off comes the top, and that gives you access to your gas system. And then everything else is basically the same. So Sterling have kept the bits that worked, and they've binned most of the bits that don't work, or probably wouldn't work. Pretty good feel for it. If I can do it, anyone can do it. So this three-part gas system here, the piston, the tappet arrangement, that's again AR18 like, but we do have this gas regulator that is adjustable, so you can push in and turn it, and it has 4 positions. So that's something that you'd expect a simplified rifle like this to do away with. On the other hand, it does let you have a wider sort of reliability range for different environments, different conditions. So they've left in the adjustable gas regulator, effectively carried over from the LAR. And that's the whole thing in bits. So it's an LAR made a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, lighter, easier to produce, with an AR18 trigger mechanism. It's got an adjustable gas regulator still, and it's got a minor patented quirk to the bolt carrier group. That's kind of it, really. They were pretty much onto a winner with their own parallel universe take on the AR18, and this is the second iteration. Now, we haven't got one, but there was also a Galil style side folding stock option for this. This is just a bolt in here, so remove that, remove the solid polymer stock and fit a side folder. We don't have any. If you have a line-on one, let us know. Now, this, although marketed as the Sterling assault rifle, as far as I can tell, sales were not forthcoming, or not significantly anyway. But the ability to license on to other companies did pan out, and this was licensed to Chartered Industries of Singapore, who renamed it the Singapore assault rifle. So kept the name, or designation, SAR-80, but the name changed to Singapore assault rifle. So they were able to sell, or rather Chartered Industries of Singapore were able to sell the SAR-80 to a number of countries. So we actually got the Croatian army. I don't know the quantities on these, by the way. If anyone knows, please do comment. The Slovenian army, Papua New Guinea, the Defence Force, Sri Lanka, the Central African Republic, that was for their gendarmerie, so militarised police, I guess, Zaire, and perhaps most notably to Somalia. 20,000 of these were bought by the Somali government. Now those were, at some point, quite a bit of unrest in that country, around about 1993 in particular. The armories were clearly not that well secured, and a number of warlords and other people must have got hold of these things, because the first time I ever saw a picture of one of these in the wild, as it were, was from Chris Chivers of the New York Times, who was a small arms, it's a journalist, but at the time was looking into small arms proliferation, and he sent me a photo of a really beat up looking one of these with no stock, and it had been taken from a Somali pirate boat. And that was not the last one of those that I saw from a Somali pirate context. So a number of those must have made it into use and were still functioning 20 or more years later. I don't know if they're still around now. I suspect they're probably giving up the ghost. Not your standard armament for Somali pirates. You might think of them having Kalashnikovs in the original 7.62 by 39 caliber. This is 5.56 NATO. Good luck getting any spares for these things. Even if they were able to appropriate spares when the rifles were taken, the end user of this is not going to have access to those. So not a sustainable weapon. Who knows, might even not be functional by sort of 2000-ish. But it looks like a gun. It's enough to intimidate with and to acquire loot with, I guess. So a slightly ignominious end to not a hugely successful small arms story, but probably, and it's probably not a spoiler to say this because there is one more of these to cover at some point, maybe. Not a huge spoiler to say that this is as good as it got for Sterling in the rifle side of the business. Now, as this is a sort of cost-effective equivalent to something like an AR18 or an AR15/M16, I did make a point of looking up some costs for this. So we have 1983, the cost of an M16A1 was $540. The cost of the SAR-80 was $350. You do the maths, I suppose, as to whether the extra $200 is worth it for an M16 versus this. Thank you as always for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. We do have a range of social media accounts that you can follow. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also now there is a Royal Armouries Reddit account floating around in the ether. So if you'd like to follow that, you'll be able to make sure you see everything that we put out there from the collection and from the museum. We also have at the moment a relatively new book out called Treasures of the Royal Armouries. If you'd like to go and check that out as well, you're very welcome. And of course you can come and visit one of our sites. You'll be very welcome. Thanks very much.